Good evening, everyone. Sorry about the little bit of a delay there. I accessed the live a little bit differently and it goofed up. So I just wanted to make sure I said hi to everyone. Tonight's topic is I wouldn't say controversial. It's something that I'm deeply concerned about. Obviously, when I first put this thing up, no one kind of knew the status of what was going to happen between Russia and Ukraine. My whole purpose actually at that point was to more sit down and talk about the viability of Russia invading the Ukraine. And obviously in that time span, as we all know now, the Ukraine is under full-blown attack by the Ukraine. I want to state up front that, again, with Hillbilly Harbinger, I'm by no means an expert on this stuff. I am a bit of a fanatic on world politics and, world events and history, Western civilization, all those types of things. I'm very enthralled by it. But I think the reason I wanted to talk about what's happening right now between the Russia and Ukraine is because of the severity of understanding it. And obviously there's a lot of things going around on the various media types. And I just felt it's important that I'll provide what information I have, some of my opinions on it. I really encourage people to ask questions via the comments because, again, this is something I'm not quite sure a lot of people really understand the implications of what's going on between Russia and the Ukraine. So before we jump into some of the talks as to why this is important to Canada, why it should be important to the world, I want to go through just a little bit of background on some of this stuff. So first of all, I want people to understand that this isn't really a direct issue between the Ukraine and Russia. What we're really talking about is it's an issue between communist bloc beliefs and NATO, which is democratic beliefs. That's really what this is about. There's lots of other smaller alternative reasons that this is happening, but we really need to understand that this really is about kind of communism blocs versus NATO and democratic blocs and belief systems and government structures. So first of all, I'd like to talk to people like, what is NATO? And I think what we need to understand is that the NATO countries, and there's a lot of them. There's, I think, 32 or 30 to 32 countries in NATO. Is basically it's a treaty agreement amongst a whole bunch of countries that have basically unique community values, are committed to principles, individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and rule of law. So those are kind of the principles that bring countries together to sign underneath of NATO. Obviously, some of the big juggernauts within NATO are the United States, France, UK, and then a lot of other smaller countries, including Canada. So what does NATO really mean? Well, basically, it's an agreement amongst all of those countries, not necessarily to act like one, but to basically rally behind three main agreements with each other. One is collective defense. So I don't know if you've heard the whole term, but you attack one NATO country, you attack them all. And that makes it a very powerful entity. So understand that, all these countries have signed on to do a collective defense. The other thing is crisis management. So IK, what's happening right now in the Ukraine. So NATO has all agreed that if there's a crisis occurring, they will work together to find the best solutions for it. And one of the ways you could look at that right now is, for instance, how NATO is putting all of the various sanctions against Russia. So that's another way that those bodies can work together. And finally, the other one is cooperative security. And this is a little bit different. Security is more around economic issues, social issues, things like that. It's not to be confused with collective defense. Defense is very much a military action versus the other one. So that's what NATO is it's all of these countries that meet the criteria of, community values, principles of individual liberty, democracy, human rights, rules of law, all those types of things, that all agree that they're going to do, basically collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. Now, if we move to the other side, which is countries that follow under communist blocs, communism is something very different. And basically, it's and I'm going to explain what communism is, because I think a lot of people have an idea what it is, but there is some major components to communism that makes it fundamentally different than NATO and a democratic type situation. So first of all, communism is a monopoly of power of the ruling Communist Party. And so how is that different? Well, if you look at most democracies, they have multiple party systems, whereas communist parties it's a monopoly of power by a communist party. So the whole electoral process is fundamentally a very different beast. It's also about democratic centralism. So in other words, that's a really neat way of saying tyranny or dictator. Like, I mean, it's a very nice way of saying that democratic centralism mean that the country is run by one idea, by sometimes one person or one group. The other thing is state ownerships and means of production. This is a lot of things people don't realize. We have the benefit of owning our own houses, our own property, whereas in a communist thing, all of that power and all of that ownership and especially production, larger scale business is run by the communist group. So you don't really have the right to own that is owned by the Communist Party. The other thing is they're centrally planned rather than market economy. So in other words, again, how things are run is based on what the Communist Party says. So really, you have no say. All of those things around economy are done by the communist regime, versus like in our situation, we have market economies. We can run our own businesses. We can do whatever the heck we want, to be honest, whereas those things are not. And then, of course, obviously, it's a membership of international communist movement. We are, like, for instance, with the Ukraine, the Ukraine had talked about joining NATO, but we allow countries to do that, whereas the communists have a little bit of a different belief in that they believe that they should be doing a communist movement. In other words, their way of believing how government should be run is the way everybody should run it. Whereas NATO has a fundamental difference. We believe in democracy, and we would like to see countries come on board, but we leave it up to the countries to come on board. We don't really push the issue saying that it should be run, this way by everybody. So now that we understand the difference between NATO and communism, you'll see that there's fundamental differences between these two regimes. And so now when you come to Canada or the US and you come to Putin, you can see how, he believes that what he's doing in the Ukraine, he has the right to do it. He believes that his sphere of influence included the Ukraine in the past, and this is how he does it. He moves in, conquers it, and basically spreads that whole international communist movement. So it's not too much of a surprise that a communist country, especially, one like Russia, is doing what they're doing. Now, let's move to another thing we need to understand besides the two parties at play here is also the former Russia. And it's actually not Russia, it was the USSR. And, for all you hockey nuts out there, I mean, some of the biggest rivalries was watching the USSR playing Team Canada. But the USSR is a very different beast than what today's Russia is. So first of all, we need to understand the former USSR was actually made up of 15 different sovereign states, which included Russia. And when we say sovereign, it's they function separately as government, but they're all basically taking direction from Mother Russia or the motherland. Right. So even though we say that it's, 15 sovereign states, the reality is the former USSR was, 15 provinces run by Mother Russia. There wasn't really a whole lot of respective opinion from those other sovereign states. It was technically run by the USSR. Um, but however, we need to understand that when the collapse of the USSR happened, 12 of those 15 states went independent, including the Ukraine. And also, it's fundamental to understand that of those 12, that now some of those states are actually NATO countries. And now you can start to see where the problem is lying, is that, something that used to be under USSR authority is now a part of NATO. And if you remember the talk about the difference between the two, it's very different. And the Ukraine was in talks about joining NATO. They've enjoyed democracy for the last 8 to 10 years, and they were going that route. And that's what was really making Putin mad, is that, all of these 12 states, with the exception of Belarus, basically are moving towards NATO way of life, which is democracy. And Putin was really feel threatened by that. So I'm sure everybody who's listened to Putin talk over the last, 4 months leading up to this, he kept talking about how the USSR and the failure of the USSR, in his mind, was the most catastrophic thing to happen in all history. And he said that, for him, those 15 states were his sphere of interest or sphere of influence. And he really wants that back. And the Ukraine was an easy target because they're not attached to NATO yet. And also, besides Russia, it's the second biggest landmass with the most resources, ports that are on the Black Sea. Like, there's lots of other reasons. But the reality is he knew that he could probably move into the Ukraine the easiest because, again, they're not a part of NATO. But right on the border of the Ukraine is Romania and Poland and all of the countries that, Latvia, that all used to be a part of the original USSR, but now are signatories to NATO and have enveloped, or not enveloped, but have adopted the democracy way of life, which is, as you can remember from the beginning, is the exact opposite. So now we're starting to formulate the history of, why the Russia-Ukraine situation is so volatile. So let's talk about what's happening in Ukraine right now. And I'm sure I'm not telling anybody anything different than what they've heard. I myself have been glued to the TV, talking to people in the Ukraine via social media and stuff like that. And so basically, yes, I know Putin has kind of indicated that his move into the Ukraine is about peacekeeping, and then it shifted to about liberating the Russians that live there. And, that he didn't look at it as full-blown war, but let's face it, this is full-blown war. And the Ukraine has, gone into martial law and has announced its full-blown war. And I think everybody else is tired of Putin's, watering down of everything, the lies, the deceit. This is full-blown war. He is there to take the Ukraine back under Russia and try to build that concept of the USSR again. Right now, most of what's happening is bombing and airstrikes, weakening targets, kind of preparing the battlefield. There has been some ground troops and tanks moving in, but for as far as fully blowing into the cities and really trying to neutralize Ukraine, they're still basically doing the whole shock and awe tactic, which is to level things and go in there. The one thing that I've heard that's fairly positive, I've heard it from multiple sources, is the Ukraine is fighting pretty ferocious, more so than I think what Russia was expecting. And also after the first day, I've heard that their casualties are I don't want to say pretty good because that's horrible, but I mean, I've heard that there's only 50 to 60 fatalities and about 180 some wounded, considering when you're talking armies in the hundreds of thousands. The Ukraine seems to be, doing fairly good. But we do have to remember there hasn't been a lot of the face-to-face or, ground combat yet. A lot of this is still outer perimeter contact and basically weakening the field. Kind of no different than any other military tactic of like the U.S. moving into Afghanistan. You go in behind the scenes, you drop your special forces to take out special targets, and you blow stuff up. I think the military term, I'm hoping one of my really good friends is on here who was in the military. I think they call it preparing the battlefield or molding the battlefield or something like that. So that's kind of important to understand what's happening in the Ukraine. But something else is happening on the Russia side, which is actually really interesting, is that there is some small protests that are starting to break out. When I say small, I'm talking like 100 to 1,000 people. And the reason I want to bring this up is a lot of stuff I've been hearing is that there is an underlying non-support for the war against the Ukraine. And why would that be? Well, because Putin's purposes is to put the USSR back together, right? His is strictly, military, it's power, it's about resources, it's about a whole bunch of things. But I think the reason the people are kicking back on this is what we do need to understand is although the Ukraine is a sovereign country running under democracy, they still are very closely related to the Russians. And it's not unusual to have Russian family in Russia and Ukraine family in Ukraine that are related. And so I think, the fact that he's going to war and willing to kill Ukrainian military and Ukrainian civilians, even though he's saying he's not targeting them, and I do believe right now they're not, but we all know there's casualties of war. I think a lot of the problem comes into the fact that, there's Russians sitting there watching their families potentially die by the hands of Russians. So, and also too, I don't think, if you go back to the USSR days, and for any of you who remember hockey playing, they were emotionless people. They were, it was a very different type of Russia. Whereas I think a lot of the present day Russia, the people have Western concepts. They have Western ideas. They understand, other countries and see what they have. And so I don't think it's as stoic of a Russia as it used to be. And I think that the people are seeing this and not agreeing with what Putin's doing. And that could actually down the road really benefit us, especially if things go up. Now, I do want to bring one thing up, and I know this is going to be, people are going to be going, oh, on it. If you watch the way that Russia is handling their protest, they go in fast. They have no problem using force. They immediately arrest, sometimes beat, and throw them in jail. Why am I bringing this up? Because that's how a communist country deals with protest. It's considered illegal right off the hop to speak even against the Russian or powers that are in to be. To even speak against what Putin is doing is illegal. You have no rights on that, and you're immediately dealt with. And this is one of the reasons that I get a little bit frustrated on the Freedom Convoy because, people are talking about peaceful protests, and I can't believe, the RCMP are moving in the way they are. Well, that's because, the Freedom Convoy was given the right to go and protest. And they did for like 3 weeks with some intervention, but, not that bad, right? And then, of course, finally it got to a certain point where finally, they implemented certain things and went in and broke up the protest. But that's a very different thing than what happens in Russia, in true communist countries where you have no rights. And I've heard the argument like, oh well, it's moving there. Well, it's not moving there. Because the reality is NATO is all about democracy. NATO is all about, and just as NATO has stepped in, all those countries have stepped in to say, Russia, what you're doing is wrong. At the same time, realize, what was happening with the Freedom Convoy, which is the right to protest. And, people were given a voice to hear, and eventually it was broken up because at the end of the day, you got to get back to business. Was some arrests made? Yes, because there was some stuff that was deemed to be against criminal code. They'll go through the justice system. That stuff doesn't happen in Russia. There's no justice system. You get arrested on the spot, you're thrown in jail. And I'll tell you right now, there's times in Russia where sometimes you don't even make it to the jail. You're just silenced. So I think, we need to kind of put this in perspective. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to have the talk tonight, because we're seeing some very interesting parallels where Canadians think they have it so bad, but the reality is what's happening in Russia right now and what's happening in the Ukraine is a true attack on freedom and a true view into Russia of what communism is like. And I'm telling you, folks, in Canada, we got it pretty damn good. So the next thing I want to talk about is why is this important to Canada and why is it important to the world? And this is something that I've kind of built this whole background up to talk about. The reason this is so important to Canada and the reason it's so important to the world is for a few different reasons. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. And this is where a lot of people are a little bit nervous about. Yes, Russia has invaded the Ukraine. We get that. But there's a very big unknown variable out there in a country called China. If it was Russia on their own and NATO, that's one thing, right? But we have to remember, as much as NATO has its allies, there's not a situation that is as tight as NATO from Russia's perspective, but there is other communist regimes and blocs that are friends of Russia. So we have some of them. The big one in the room is China, because it's a comparable superpower to US. So they kind of cancel each other out. And then you go, okay, what's left, right? Well, the reality is there's China there, there's North Korea there, and as crazy as Mr. Kim is, the reality of it is they do have one of the largest on the ground people armies in the world, and not all there. Then there's other countries as well too that are communists as well, and they're falling in as potential allies for Russia. But the big one is China. Right now China has said that okay, we believe there should be a diplomatic solution to this, and that Russia should work with Ukraine to come to some sort of understanding. But the critical thing that hasn't happened that makes me nervous is they're not doing the sanctions. They're not doing anything. They're just kind of giving lip service to it, saying, well, we should, do a diplomatic solution. But they're not doing anything to outright condemn Russia. They're not doing anything right now now that they've attacked Russia, they're not doing anything to really say to Russia, we 100% are willing to stand behind the fact that we think there should be a democratic process happening here. There's also something very similar in China that's happening between Russia and Ukraine, which is a country called Taiwan. And basically, China has the same vision for Taiwan that Russia is carrying out right now with the Ukraine. So, right now, there's a lot of issues that could go wrong. And the biggest thing I think I'm waiting on, I get it, NATO saying this and sanctions and everything like that, but I'm kind of sitting on a hot iron right now going, where's China in this issue? I have some theories that I think NATO, and especially the NATO partners, provide a larger economy for China than what Russia does. But is that enough to outweigh the fact that China is a communist country and shares the same belief system as Russia? And China and Russia are partners, right? So although I think we put more economics into the country, I'm still unsure of what could happen there. So that's one variable. Now, the other variable is the scariest aspect of this, which is a small thing that everybody's been throwing around called World War III. Does this have the potential to become a world war? Damn rights it does. As a matter of fact, if you compare it to some of the movement of when the Nazi Party got into Germany and how they started conquering small countries and kept going, and then eventually people started piling in against them and other people joined them, this kind of has the making of it. Right now, Putin's saying this is only about the Ukraine. But a week ago, Putin was saying it was just about war games outside of the boundaries of the Ukraine. So is it about the Ukraine? For instance, if he conquers the Ukraine, does it stop there? Or does he push to Poland? Or does he push to Latvia? And the problem with that is those are now NATO. And if you remember back to what I talked about the fundamental belief system in NATO, you attack one, you attack all. All of them have a treaty obligation to now go in and defend that country. They have no choice. So can this be World War III? Damn rights it can. Like it, and if you go back to my China comment, if China starts throwing support behind Russia, which I don't know, or if China decides that, wow, Russia's doing pretty good in the Ukraine, there's not much response from NATO, does that give them the balls now to go after Taiwan? Right? So this is one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about this, is that there's a lot of world politics playing out right now. And the reality of it is Russia may have triggered a bit of a time bomb. And a part of that time bomb could be World War III. And the other thing that really makes me scary, and I think a lot of it is still scare tactics, because at the end of the day, although Putin is a psychopath, but I don't think any of us want to die. But what scares me is he's thrown threats of nuclear weapons. And for people that don't know, like, Russia has, I think it's the biggest nuclear arsenal. I think they even have more than the U.S. Now, for as far as NATO, he definitely doesn't have as much as NATO, because we got to remember some of our other allies like France and UK all have nukes. But the reality of it is it doesn't matter. We're still talking about 6,000-7,000 nuclear weapons on both sides. That's enough to annihilate the Earth 15 times over. So the fact that he's even mentioned nukes is terrifying, because I think he's using it as a scare tactic. But do I think in desperate times, where if Russia's losing ground, that he wouldn't do a desperate attempt? I'm not confident in that. So, not only is this about World War III, but this is also talking about potential Armageddon, because the reality is, it doesn't matter how strong all of us think we are, or if we think we can win a war. If nukes are used, nobody wins. Nobody wins. And that's something that we all need to really understand. Like, I see some people throwing up comments like, oh, we'll nuke them. You know what? If you think that's cool, you're stupid. And I'm sorry for being rude, but it's like, nobody wins in a nuclear war. Nobody. And so I think World War III kind of has some scary traits to it, because we don't know how that's all going to play out. And I know we can say something as cool as, oh, we'll just nuke Russia. But what's right south of Russia? China. Do you think China really wants to or will support nuclear weapons going off just over their border? No, they won't. They will immediately look at that as a hostile action as well. So I think that's one of the things that we need to understand, is that, even though right now this is just about Russia invading the Ukraine, the reality is there is so many arms of this octopus that could push us into World War III. We all need to be paying attention to this. The other thing that we need to understand, and this is going to start affecting us all immediately, is even though the United States and Canada and the UK have all said we're hitting severe sanctions now, because Russia needs to be taught and needs to be basically economically broken, to say bad Russia. But sanctions don't just affect Russia, because the reality is Russia is a massive importer-exporter to a lot of the European countries and even to North America. They're a major oil and gas provider. They're the third largest grain provider in the world. So when we're closing sanctions off, that also closes it off coming to us or coming to Europe. So we need to understand that, although we're playing tough on the sanctions, we're all going to feel that over the next month, 2 months, 6 months, 2 years. If it goes to major war, it could be 5 years, 6 years. That those sanctions are all going to affect us. If you think gas is high now, it's going to go up. If you think cereal products are high now, it's going to go up. There's going to be a lot of those trade routes will be interrupted, and companies are going to do their best to try working around it so that the demand comes from somewhere else. But sanctions are going to hurt us. And as a matter of fact, if you listen to President Biden talk about it, he indicated that to his citizens right away, that he's going to do everything he can to limit the impact. But the reality is sanctions are going to hurt us. And considering we're so heavily tied to the U.S. and we get the same type of stuff from Russia, it is going to impact us. Now, the other thing that we need to also understand about this is Russia, if you heard me at the beginning, I talked about the fact that Russia, and again, people, before I go on to this point, if you have any questions or any comments, please put them down because I will address them right now. Once this gets uploaded, everything like that, it's very tough for me to come back and deal with something. And if it is something afterwards, just PM me and I will answer back. I'm very good at that. So let's go back to, so this is the real reason Putin's attacking. Okay, and if you remember at the beginning of this, I was talking about, this isn't so much just about the UK, although there's some benefits to him of having the second largest landmass there, to add on. It now allows him to have a bit of a buffer between Moscow and the NATO, because now Poland and Ukraine would become the front. But I'll tell you right now, what this is really about is this: Putin feels that there is an attack on communism and that democracy is pushing him. And so that's why he's trying to stop this trend that has happened ever since World War II of NATO expanding eastward to the point of some of the countries being up against his border. And the Ukraine is a big one because it's a very big chunk of land by Russia, but essentially now if you go up north of Belarus, and you look at where NATO is there, and now the Ukraine would be a part of NATO. I mean, he literally is surrounded by the entire Western and Eastern bloc of NATO. So we also need to understand that that's another important factor is, he wants the original USSR back so that it gets rid of a lot of the NATO, gets rid of the democracy, reinstates communism, but also gives him a very solid front that's a long distance away from Moscow. So that's something important to understand. Now, I've seen a lot of comments where people are trying to simplify what's happening. And I think the one reason I want to break down and show all the background on this and talk about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and why this should be important to us is we mostly absorb ourselves within our country's politics. But there is a much larger theater out there called world politics. And it is a very dynamic beast. And the reason is because for most of us, we fight over certain issues of politics, and that's why we vote either liberal or conservative or NDP or whatever. But on a world politic front, it's much more complex. There's much more at play here. There's import-export. There's positioning. There is, oh God, the list can go on. I mean, all you have to do is look at the United Nations files, and you can see all of the issues that are there. So when country leaders, especially superpower leaders like the US, it's not as simple. Like I've seen so many people say, oh, we should have prevented this by just jumping into the Ukraine and fighting. Well, it's not that simple. I wish it was. But as you've heard me, we got to think about World War III. We got to think about nuclear weapons. We got to think about, sanctions we're going to put and the kind of pressure that's going to be. There's so much more on a world front that leaders have to take into consideration. If I told you that by NATO jumping in there, it could trigger China jumping on board, or we could start beating them back to the point that Putin gets desperate and pushes the button. And as I had said, once he pushes the button, we can make as much arguments about who has more nukes, but the reality is it does not freaking matter at all. Because in a nuclear war, doesn't matter how good our Star Wars programs are, doesn't matter how good our anti-missile systems are, stuff's going to make it through. And with the amount of bombs that are out there, even if only 10% make it through, our lives will never be the same again. We will go into nuclear war. All of our systems will be upset. Millions and billions of people are going to get killed. Like that's some of the things that weigh on leaders' heads is, what do we do if we act all tough and jump in and we make a guy like Putin? Do I think Putin has the capability of pushing a button? I think Putin would rather nuke the world than to admit defeat. I just think that's his character. He literally is psychopathic. He's a sociopath. These are the kind of people that when they're in power like they are right now, they're great dictators. But when they start to lose that, they'll do anything to survive and anything to not lose face in the world. scheme of things. So I think that's one of the things I want to say to people. Please do not simplify world politics. It is not as simple as, let's flex our muscle and go in and do something. And the other thing you got to remember too is NATO has a treaty amongst NATO. Now it's horrible what's happening in the Ukraine, but right now the reality is there is no treaty there that bonds us to the whole concept of attack one, attack all. But like I said, there's also a lot at play right now that world leaders have to think of, and they don't have a choice. So, and that kind of goes to the question I was going to bring up, is a lot of people have emailed me saying, why is NATO not getting involved? Why are we just doing sanctions? Well, because the reality is, again, there's a lot more at play here. And one of the things I got to say is we've always dealt with wars since World War II that are very isolated wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, like these are countries that are almost third world countries, don't have a whole lot of capabilities, and basically the majority of the battle stays away from us. We don't really get to see it. We see it on TV, and we see the repercussions of it when our veterans come back. But the reality is, it's not like those countries can strike out and hit, Canada or the U.S. I mean, we experienced it a little bit in 9/11, where terrorists did come here and kind of, impact us, and I mean mostly the U.S., but there was citizens in the World Trade Centers from all over, including Canada. But honestly, on a scale of war, that's a fairly small scenario. It's a lot different when war touches down in your country, where you've got jets going overhead and ballistic missiles coming and everything like that. So, really, we're kind of lucky in North America. We've really never experienced that. And the countries we fought really don't have those capabilities. Russia does. Russia not only has intercontinental ballistic missiles with just warheads on them, but again, they have the big scary one, which is intercontinental ballistic missiles that have nuclear warheads on them. So can Russia reach out and touch us? Damn rights they can. They definitely can. So I think that's one thing that's really important to understand. Shannon, you put a comment in there saying this is Europe, not a smaller unknown country. I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, definitely the Ukraine is Europe. It borders a lot of the other countries. But again, it still comes back to the fact that not all of Europe is on board with NATO. As a matter of fact, Belarus is a part of the Russia bloc, and it is Europe as well. But it's tough. Like we wouldn't be sitting here right now if this was Poland, because Poland's a part of NATO. We'd be literally watching our forces from all over NATO coming in and laying the boots to Russia. Do I think that's a good thing? Well, I do to a certain extent. But again, do I think that would be a catalyst for World War III? I definitely think it could be. Because again, great, we push and beat the snot out of Russia and send them back home. But how desperate is Putin going to be to lose those things? Is that going to stop him from launching nukes into Poland? And then how do we respond? Do we just sit back and go, oh, well, or does some of our countries end up launching nukes into Russia? And if they do launch them into Russia, what's the response going to be of their neighbor, which is China, right? And we have to remember, China butts up against Russia. So nuclear fallout doesn't just stay where the nukes hit, it affects a massive area. So again, there's a lot at play here. Now, usually I only do 30 minutes, people, but I'm 10 minutes past that right now. But I felt this is an important topic to talk about. And there's a few things I've been seeing in social media that I just have to speak about. Because I'll be honest, it doesn't make me angry. It makes me pissed off. And I need to address it, and I need to get it off my chest. Is I'm seeing people in Canada that are comparing the trucker convoy to the issues in of what's happening in the Ukraine. That's not what I want to say. I'd like to say something else, but the reality is not. It's not even bloody close. And I'm tired of listening to people say that we're moving towards communism. Well, first of all, BS. Do your research. Go and look at what communism really means. Go and look what freedom really means. Normally, I'm not so vocal on this because I do like people to have their own opinions, their own beliefs, everything like that. But when I'm seeing what's happening in Ukraine, and here's why I'm speaking out to it, we seem to forget that social media is social worldwide. And right now, there are people in other parts of the world, including the Ukraine, that is watching social media. I am absolutely ashamed as a Canadian if a Ukrainian person right now is sitting there reading someone saying that what is happening with the Freedom Convoy and relations with Canada is similar to what's happening to those people. That is absolute BS. The Ukraine is in a true fight for freedom right now. Their people, as we're talking right now, are dying on the ground. Protesters in Russia are being beaten and thrown in jail for even protesting. This is not the same situation in Canada, people. And it absolutely sickens me that there is one Ukrainian person right now that's under attack, potentially could be looking at democracy going out the door and having a communist regime come in, and that we're sitting here and trying to compare what happened in Ottawa, as being the same thing. Not even bloody close. And I will sit across the table to anybody and I will fight that situation because that infuriates me. It absolutely infuriates me that people are even thinking about making that comparison. I have friends who come from Ukrainian families. I have friends that have Ukrainian family over in the Ukraine. And I mean, as Canadians, and it's why I made the topic, we need to shake our head and wake up. We really do, because right now the world's teetering on the edge of World War III. And honestly, we're talking right now about freedom and fighting for freedom in the Ukraine, and potentially all of us fighting for freedom if Russia decides to push further, to mandates and to protest. And I do not give a crap what anybody says. Those things are not comparable at all. And it needs to stop. We need to unify right now to show that Canada is behind the Ukraine. And we need to really concentrate our efforts in supporting our leaders. And everybody knows me. I am not a Justin Trudeau fan. As a matter of fact, I would like to wipe him right out of politics and never see him again. But in this situation, I am setting all of those aside because right now we need to support our country. We need to support our other NATO alliances to do whatever we can to stop what's happening in the Ukraine and prevent World War III. That's what's the most important thing right now. The last thing I want to see is, and it leads to me about supporting leaders, I'm seeing people using the responses of countries to push forward their own narrative of not liking their leader. And all I can say is I've been lucky. I'm at the age where I kind of was born at the tail end of World War II and kind of Vietnam, and I've really lived my whole life not experiencing World War. But I've talked to people and veterans from World War II, not so much World War I. I've studied both of those wars. And this is the time that countries need to put their pettiness aside, including their political beliefs, and support Canada, and support the USA, and support the UK, and support France, and support Australia, and support New Zealand. Because the reality is we need to act as NATO now. We need to stop the push of a bully who right now is killing people for his own personal reasons. And I can't be strong enough about that. I actually gave a tongue lashing via text to a guy who was basically trying to state that the whole thing is all Biden's fault. Bullshit. And I'm sorry to be blunt, it is not. The reality of this is, maybe even prior to Trump being in, definitely prior to Trudeau being in, Putin has been planning this. You don't do these type of strategic movements and potentially triggering a world war by sitting down and jotting on the pad in the last 2 weeks and going, yeah, I think this is what we're going to do. Putin has said this for as long as I can remember Putin in, that the USSR was the biggest mistake that ever happened in the history of the world of it breaking up. Putin has had this idea in his head, has strategically planned it, has strategically manipulated everything to the point of executing what he's doing right now. This is not the fault of any world leader. This is 100% the fault of Vladimir Putin. So, I hate it when I see people using these narratives, or using this situation to fit their narrative, so politically somehow they can pound on their chest. And you know what? I'm a Canadian first. And right now, the Ukraine needs Canada. And that means a unified Canada to help support them. Just like the US, they need that. That's what they need right now. Because as much as we think we're being so robbed in Canada, I want to point out again, people are dying in the Ukraine right now to fight for their freedom, to fight for their home, to fight for the belief system, the political system. They're fighting for all of that right now. And I just am appalled. And I say this with absolute sincerity. And I absolutely am appalled that people are writing some of the stuff they are, understanding that people from all over the world read that, including the Ukrainians. And I just think that we need to shake our heads and wake up. And that's why I called this Wake Up. That's why I want to talk over my 30-minute mark, is because I want to bring some of this stuff out. And even if I can reach 2 or 3 people, it's worth it. But I think we really do need to wake up, Canada, and understand that, we have World War III sitting on our doorstep. We have the Ukrainian people right now fighting for, their rights and freedoms. And people are dying, not just soldiers, but I think one of the most heartbreaking things I saw is I have my good friend John Kozushko over, who is Ukrainian, and we were watching the news today. And we literally saw a video of a baba, a grandmother, wearing full fatigues, carrying a machine gun. And it really hit me. Like, here's an older lady who should be enjoying the retirement, should be enjoying grandchildren, and she is dressed in full battle fatigues to go out and fight for her home, to fight for her grandkids, to fight for her kids. That's a real freaking thing. It's a real thing, and I think that's the thing we need to understand, that these people are fighting for their lives. And my good friend who just joined me, Matthew, who is a veteran, and Matthew, again, I'd like to thank you and all veterans for your service. And I'm glad you announced it. But here the Ukraine just announced that they may seek nuclear option to combat Russia aggression. That's horrifying. That's absolutely horrifying. That happens. Someone pushes that button. And I'm telling you right now, people, the world is going to be a different place. We're going to be remembering back to these days and wishing we had what we did have. So I'm going to end it with that. I just want to say that I'm proud of my country. I'm proud of Canada. I'm proud of NATO. And all I want to say, people, is this is the time to set our differences aside and to rally as nations, as an alliance. Not put BS up there for Ukraine to look at. We need to really pull ourselves together. So I just want to say to you guys, don't know y'all, but love y'all. Be together with family. Talk, because this is scary stuff. Talk, so that it doesn't build up. And all I got to say to everyone is, let's just keep talking, supporting each other. And, we'll just keep moving through. I will be doing a Hillbilly Harbinger next week. So I really appreciate it. If you guys have any other topics that you'd like to discuss, let's do it. So again, signing off. Love you all.